Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'd like to welcome you back to another WSR live streaming session. Today, we are going to continue with our discussions on a variety of topics as we move through the next phase of the environmental assessment process after the TOR approval, terms of reference approval. Every other week on Wednesdays at the same time, we will discuss a new topic and want to encourage you to provide us as much input as possible by calling or texting us with your questions or comments. You can call or text us at 1-844 424 0500. That's toll free 1-844 424 0500. And just to remind everyone, we are doing these radio shows and streaming sessions to help community members and the general public better understand what is involved in the federal impact assessment and provincial environmental assessment processes, and to encourage viewers and listeners to participate in both of these activities. With me today is Marian Tebor Mcmahon, who is the Deputy Project Manager for ICE on the Webequie Supply Road project. Good afternoon, Marion, and welcome back for another Webequie Supply Road chat.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, in today's session, which is simply called Wildlife and Species at Risk Field Studies, we're going to talk about the activities associated with wildlife and species at risk that are such a big part of the environmental and impact assessment work on this project. Hopefully, this will help community members understand the purpose of these studies and how important it is to participate actively in these studies. Okay, Marion, let's get started now. Maybe you can do a quick run through of what we're going to cover today.
Sure. So we'll start off by just reminding everyone where we are in the environmental assessment process. And then we'll dive in to talk about the objectives of the wildlife and species at risk field studies. We'll go into what will be studied for both species at risk and wildlife. And then we'll dive into the different field surveys to survey species at risk and wildlife. And then we'll talk about criterion indicators. And then we'll even talk about potential mitigation methods to reduce potential effects on wildlife and species at risk. And then we'll wrap up by letting everyone know when our next live streaming event is and the topic of discussion.
Thanks, Marion. And before we go any further, let's briefly talk about where we are in the overall planning process. So back on last October the 8th, we reached a pretty important project milestone, which was the MECP, or regulatory body approval of our terms of reference. The terms of reference for the environmental assessment is the work plan for the environmental assessment. So we achieved that on October 8th, and then we officially moved from what's known as the terms of reference phase, or the TOR phase, to the EA phase. So that was a big milestone, and so that's where we sit now. We are busy completing the studies that are associated with the EA phase. And Marion, before we get things rolling in terms of diving in deeply on the field studies, why don't you talk a bit now about the objectives of the wildlife and species at risk studies?
Sure. So the main objectives of the wildlife and species at risk field studies are basically to characterize what those existing conditions are in terms of species at risk and wildlife. So that way we will be able to identify and consider what those potential effects may be on terrestrial wildlife and species at risk, as well as their habitats as a result of the project. And then from there, we will be able to provide recommendations for reducing or minimizing those negative effects, whether that be environmental, health, social, and economic effects related to wildlife and wildlife habitat and species at risk during two phases of the project, during construction and then during operations and maintenance.
Okay, let's move now to talk about what actually will be studied, starting with the species at risk, or as we know it, SAR. So This basically involves, first of all, characterizing the existing conditions in the project area, establishing that baseline. And then this is a combination of two main activities using publicly available background information and then data collected from the actual field studies or investigations. Um, well, I should note that species that occupy larger areas, such as Wolverine and Caribou, are assessed differently. They're assessed at a larger, more regional scale because because these animals have such large ranges. They cover such large territories. And another note to make is that we'll be assessing specific potential effects that could have any potential effects that could have like lingering negative effects to species at risk. And these could be increased human access by construction of the road, um, injury or mortality through collisions, for example, spills, or alterations to water bodies and the landscape in general. Now, just to give everyone a bit of a background on the species at risk in the area, I'll run through the different species, and there's a species of bats called little brown myotis. In terms of mammals, there's two sort of populations of caribou. One is boreal population, the other is the eastern migratory population, and then we have the wolverine as another species at risk mammal. In terms of fish, the Lake Sturgeon, the southern Hudson Bay and James Bay population is the species at risk related to fish. And in terms of birds, there are a number of birds that are species at risk, including bald eagle, bank swallow, barn swallow, Canada warbler, common nighthawk, evening grosbeak, olive-sided flycatcher, rusty blackbird, and yellow rail. Maybe, Marion, you can talk a bit now about what will be studied for wildlife.
Sure. So, what we study for wildlife, we study what we call criteria species. And this list of criteria species is based on input that we received from working with government agencies, indigenous communities, and stakeholders because they've identified these as, I guess, important species to study. And they're intended to provide a cross section of species that can be used to infer the magnitude of potential effects on wildlife and wildlife habitat in a qualitative assessment based on the indicators, which we'll talk about later, which is a way to measure change. And this could be related to habitat availability, distribution, and abundance. So these cross section is like to represent, I guess, the species in the area. And so these criteria species exclude, so species at risk. So these would be moose, snowshoe hare, beaver, river otter, muskrat, American marten, bats, and frogs.
Thank you, Marion. Let's now dive into the actual field studies that will be done, and there are a number of them, as you know. Um, I'll kick things off here. There are the winter aerial surveys for caribou and wolverine. We've done a number of these aerial surveys now, and what they involve is flying along lines that are perpendicular at 90 degrees to the route of the road. And these are quite long, these lines, and these lines are spaced, again, parallel to each other and spaced a certain distance apart. And so what it results in is a very, very large area being covered, being surveyed, uh, which is necessary, as we talked about earlier, because caribou and wolverine have very large ranges. And so this involves a helicopter flying this route and biologists making observations. It's typically done in February and March on sunny days with snow cover to ensure that tracks can be seen as well. So this has been a really useful exercise. There's a lot of observations that are made about other things at the same time. Um, So it catches a lot of information actually. We also conducted a caribou nursery survey, and these are typically done in habitat areas that are typical for nursery areas, and these are isolated areas, low-lying areas where um, uh, predators are less likely to go. So we conducted that survey. We also did a caribou collaring project with where 29 adult female caribou were captured and then given collars, GPS collars, satellite GPS collars, so that they could be tracked, and we've been tracking them ever since then. And at the same time, after capturing them, we took blood samples looking for pregnancy status, looking at their genetics to understand perhaps where they came from. Their pellets were also analyzed genetically and for the presence or absence of parasites. Their hair was analyzed for genetics and also for to look at cortisol levels, stress levels in the animals that might indicate that they've been stressed over a period of time. And then their teeth were inspected, their molars were inspected to help identify age. We also conducted some really interesting surveys and are still doing them. Wolverine occupancy surveys, where at 25 different locations we set up a wooden structure called a run pole that wolverines could climb, and they were baited to that location. And as they climb up this pole and they go onto the platform, they have to stand up to reach the bait. And when they do that, they get their photo taken, and we use that information to identify their sex, whether they're pregnant and lactating, and we are able to identify most of the time unique individuals by their markings as well too. So there's a lot there's a lot of information that's collected as part of those surveys. And Marion, maybe now you can continue with some of the other field surveys that are done.
Sure. So, other surveys that are being done are bat habitat and maternity roost screening. So that means that the team they basically review secondary information to identify and understand any natural and man-made features along the proposed route that may provide bat habitat. And then from there, once they identify that, they go on a helicopter and then they survey the area to search for potential critical habitat features. Another survey that is being done are bat acoustic surveys. So, this survey involves approximately 10 survey stations along the proposed route of the road, and then of which three are near candidate maternity roost habitats. So they'll just take a look at that. Another survey is breeding bird point count surveys. So this involves stationary counts of all the birds seen and heard over a given time period at various survey locations just to observe what's around there. Um, the team also goes out and they do bird acoustic surveys. So, what they do there is they deploy these devices called acoustic recording units to survey the bird presence in the area. And then they take those recordings from the units, which will help support their modeling process on the abundance and the distribution of the birds. And that's also to capture temporal variation of the bird species at risk. And then lastly, they do crepuscular bird surveys. And as you were mentioning on the radio show, Dawn, crepuscular is the transition from day and night. And these are the birds that are active between dusk and dawn, such as the common nighthawk. And so this survey targets the common nighthawk birds. And these birds are known to nest in open habitats across northern Ontario, and we suspect that they are within the project study area. And they also use those acoustic recording units, and they place that around the suitable habitat areas to collect data to help inform their presence and distribution of the bird species within the area.
Continuing on with the field studies, a couple of other ones were well, one was the waterfowl migration aerial surveys, and this consists of flying the length of the planned road along the route. And then within 1 kilometer of the road on either side, we look for large bodies of water or open wetlands where waterfowl would typically land or stage when they're migrating. So this is a very thorough survey. It involves a couple of biologists, one who's observing, the other one who is recording. And what they're doing is they're doing counts, approximate counts of number of waterfowl and different species at each location to get an understanding of the importance of these different water bodies within the study area. So that's uh, that's one aerial survey. That another aerial survey that's done. There's also the raptor nesting data collection, and this is done as I oh, I didn't mention, I mentioned this on the radio show, but typically as part of the aerial surveys for caribou. Um, we would look for raptor stick nests, those big nests made of sticks at the top of very high trees, typically by rivers and lakes. So we would look for these, we would make observations on these, we would mark the locations of these as well too. And that's a very, very useful piece of information that's collected, all part of the winter caribou surveys. And if we can move to our next slide, slide number 10, this this image is actually an image just tying back to Wolverine, the Wolverine run poles we were talking about. You can see here a photo of a Wolverine that has successfully climbed the run pole and gone onto the platform and gotten its picture taken. So when this Wolverine actually climbs onto the platform, it goes through sort of a slightly narrower opening where these little clips capture samples of its hair, which are then analyzed for genetics, as we talked about before. So that's just an example of some of the photographs that we collect, and we've collected a number of photos from these locations, not always of wolverines, but often of moose and caribou who are curious about the bait that's there, other animals as well too. So that's been pretty interesting to see what we collect there. So Marion, why don't we have a look now at the criteria and indicators for species at risk?
Sure. So, as we mentioned earlier, these valued components, or what we're calling criteria, are basically components of the environment, in this case, wildlife and species at risk, that Indigenous communities, government, and stakeholders value. And then we have what we call indicators to measure the potential change on that valued component. So, in this case, the criteria species. So for bats, including the little brown myotis, to measure the potential change, we look at changes to habitat availability. So this means quantity. And then we look at changes to abundance, so the population. We also look at changes to the distribution, so this is the configuration and the connectivity of the species as well as their habitat. And then we also look at changes to species richness, so the diversity of the species. We'll look at changes to survival and reproduction. We'll look at changes to predator access, habitat use, and population, as well as change in wildlife mortality. And this could be due to, an increase in anthropogenic stressors, such as, people going out in the area, hunting, trapping, using vehicles to access areas. When we study caribou, we will be looking at things like changes to population size and trend estimates at the range level. Because there are two caribou, I guess, populations that Don was mentioning earlier in different ranges. We also look at changes to indirect mortality due to increases in prey sources like moose, leading to increased predation like wolves and bears, and then a spread of disease, for example, brainworm. We also look at changes to indirect effects due to sensory disturbances, such as light, sound, and vibration. And then we also look at changes to incidental mortality. Again, just like as we would study the bats, what that maybe could be, vehicle collisions, increased hunting pressure on caribou.
Continuing on with criteria and indicators for species at risk, looking at Wolverine, we would look at changes to habitat availability. That's quality and quantity of habitat. Changes to abundance or their populations or numbers, and the distribution, the spatial distribution of the animals as well. Too, um, in terms of whether they're connected areas that they're occupying or they're fragmented areas. Changes to species richness, like Marian talked about before. This is a common measure. It's a measure of diversity. Changes to survival and reproduction. Changes to predator access, which is an important one, habitat use and population. Again, with a road, in some cases, it might improve predator access to certain areas. Um, and of course, change in wildlife mortality due to an increase in human related impacts, such as hunting or trapping or travel by vehicles. So, moving on now to fish and fish habitat, looking at the species at risk there, Lake Sturgeon, we would look at changes to habitat available to that species, quantity and quality. We'll look at the number of water bodies crossed by the road, um, the number of water bodies, number or area of water bodies that include known or assumed critical habitat, um, in special areas like spawning areas or nursery areas, unique areas. And typically, when routing the road, we would hopefully have a pretty good idea of where these areas are and avoid these areas to a large degree. And then, of course, changes to the abundance and distribution, like with other species at risk, we would look for those changes. Uh, looking at measures of population, survival, or reproduction, and movement. And then looking at species at risk birds, including the bald eagle, bank swallow, barn swallow, Canada warbler, common nighthawk, evening grosbeak, olive-sided flycatcher, rusty blackbird, and yellow rail. Again, you're looking at very similar measures, very, very similar indicators. Changes to habitat availability, changes to abundance, changes to diversity or species richness, changes to survival and reproduction, changes to predator access, habitat use and population, and then of course wildlife mortality too. Is that increased or stayed the same as a result of, or would it increase as a result of construction of the road? So um, there's a lot of criteria and a lot of indicators associated with the different species at risk. And Marion, maybe now you can walk us through some of the potential mitigation methods associated with wildlife in SAR.
Sure. So once we determine what those potential effects may be on wildlife and species at risk, we come up with potential mitigation measures or methods to reduce or minimize or eliminate, even if we can, potential effects, potential negative effects on wildlife and species at risk. So, what would those mitigation methods look like? This could be, moving the road to avoid areas containing critical habitat for species at risk. We would avoid construction during times of breeding and in locations where migration and other essential life processes may be occurring. We would also consider the use of wildlife passages to allow for the free and safe movement of species at risk across the road. We would also regulate speed limits and have warning signs along the road for road users to reduce potential wildlife vehicle collisions. And we would also, look into establishing species-specific buffer zones and setback distances. We will also consider artificial habitats to compensate for any lost habitat features if necessary, and that could be for bank swallows or bats. And then, of course, we would implement best management practices to avoid or mitigate negative effects on caribou. Now, of course, it's important to note, as we continue moving forward throughout the effects assessment, and once we gather more information and data on wildlife and species at risk, that we will come up with more detailed mitigation methods and measures.
Yeah, that's right, Marion. I mean, once we get a better picture of the study area, better understanding of the study area through the baseline work, it can refine our mitigation methods, and it can also refine them in the sense of applying them to certain geographic areas that have unique characteristics as well. So all this accumulation of knowledge ends up with us being able to sort of provide that really very, very sort of granular level of mitigation that'll make sure that the project doesn't have long-term impacts, and then these take the form of commitments and recommendations, and then of course post-project there's a compliance monitoring uh, piece of work that's done to make sure that what we are expecting and the mitigation methods we're using, it's sort of a report card on that to ensure that we're not causing any damage at all. So that pretty well wraps up today's discussion. Join us again in 2 weeks when we're going to talk about water, and that's groundwater and surface water. And I want to also invite you to, again, to visit our website at supplyroad.ca, or visit us on social media at WFN Supply Road. There's a lot of information available on our website, and we put more on it all the time. There's a lot of easy to read information. There's some study plans that get into more specifics in terms of what we're doing as part of our studies, and they're written in plain English that should make them really sort of easy to follow for anyone. So we've tried really hard to make this information understandable so that we can encourage more communities to participate in the process. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Miigwech, and see you soon.